17 years. That is the span of time between the release of Final Fantasy X-2 and the release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I have calculated that span of time because that is the exact number of years that Square Enix took to release the Final Fantasy game that, at least narratively, was better than okay. And I have come to terms with the fact that I will probably never quite get over that. It is in scripting this essay that I think back to one of the first that I ever wrote that wasn't a part of some school project. And at the time I was trying to improve my non-fiction writing, and there was nothing I wanted to write about more than my bitter disappointment concerning the 30-minute Final Fantasy X audio drama that was supposed to top off the series. As one reviewer aptly puts it, in a standalone paragraph as well, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Now, Final Fantasy X-2 suffered, as I said about The Last of Us Part 2 last year, from sequel dissonance, something that plagues narrative continuity in many video game sequels and prequels, including AAA titles. X-2 was serviceable, but it didn't serve in the same spirit as its much-adored predecessor. I'm sorry to say that whichever way you cut it, love or hate it for it, X-2 was a hot mess. Though a hot mess with some decent battle structure and an ending that would at least do enough fan service for people to not regret the whole thing entirely. What I want to evoke emotionally here is that Final Fantasy X was something special. The first in the series with voice acting, questionable as that could be sometimes. And the first that eschewed more European influences of the series past for a more oriental and exotic feel. But most importantly, it was the last Final Fantasy story that people felt really connected to. Square Enix would experiment in the years to come with political intrigue in Final Fantasy XII and a stronger focus on character in 13, but ultimately, year after year, the games focused on trying to resolve an increasingly outdated gameplay system, without giving focus to providing players with a compelling narrative. And that is why after all these years, trying my hardest to enjoy them, I don't care about Ivalice or Cocoon or Eos, even though all of them are artistically and aesthetically well crafted, and yes, something to write home about in terms of world building. But the story and characters in 12 were too bland, and 13 was too overwrought when teeming with melodrama. Oh, and 15, I can appreciate that some liked the bros helping bros elements of it, but I'm sorry, Square Enix, I didn't get into fantasy games to order food from a Western-style diner and drive a car around. An airship, sure, but not a car. I want to stress that if you've enjoyed any Final Fantasy games in the last 17 years, then I'm all for your happiness. I don't want to take that away from anyone. But I cannot help but feel a sense of renewed disappointment that after all this time, during which a child could have been born and grown into a full adult, it has taken a remake of the fan-favourite Final Fantasy for me to return to that feeling, that know-it-when-you-know-it feeling of experiencing something special. And until now, none of Square Enix's mainline entries truly hit the mark from a narrative standpoint. They were all of them okay, but none of them were great, and one of the most successful series of fantasy games of all time deserves to have stories that are truly outstanding, or at the very least, a cut above mediocrity. Fortunately, I can say that the long wait for the remake of 7 has been worth it. Interestingly, I have to confess, I missed the boat on this the first time around. I never played Final Fantasy VII, and by the time I had a console that could actually play a port of the game, the rumour mill of a remake was well underway with the development of the PlayStation technical demo, which was showcased all the way back in 2005. Researching the year, I honestly cannot believe that it was that long ago, that this remake was teased for 15 years, and what we have now is not even the full game, but that's by the by. In all that time, I purposefully didn't research anything about the story. I know a major character death because any fan of Final Fantasy games is going to stumble upon that famous scene eventually, but I really know nothing else other than some of the things I saw in Advent Children, which I've mostly forgotten anyway. So, for For 7, my palette is completely clean, or as good as completely clean. And honestly, I haven't felt the Final Fantasy magic like this since I first played 10, which would have been around 2002. The voice acting is on point, so crisp and well delivered that it's hard for me to imagine that these characters didn't always have these voice actors delivering their dialogue. Also, it really shines through as someone who barely knows anything about this universe, considering so much of Advent Children was way over my head years ago anyway, that the magic here really is in the characters. The heroes are likeable and relatable when in mainline Final Fantasy entries over the years we've had drab, boring and overbearing protagonists. It really is as simple as this. The world is believable, I care about the characters, and I want to know what happens next. And that latter point is the really key thing, as someone who never played the original game. I've played every mainline Final Fantasy since 10-2, not any of the online ones though, sorry. And I just didn't ever really care what happened next. Noctis was always just going to spend more time in the back of a car. The 13 crowd were all going to be overdramatic or whiny or both. And as much as the plot for 12 really did have great potential, the politics in fantasy experiment just fell flat when narratives like A Song of Ice and Fire have so much more of a compelling grip on the way that kind of story should be told. Certainly not through these lengthy scenes in which none of the main characters are there or participating, and it's all far too omniscient for just about anyone's liking. I haven't completed the Final Fantasy VII Remake yet, with which fact some might call me out for making a video about it already. But it's the fact that I'm only about halfway through and have felt from this game what I haven't since specifically the ending of 10-2, and very little of the rest of it.
Stop that! Ow! That's nice.
That makes me feel, I guess, kind of vindicated, in a sense. Because as a fan of Final Fantasy X specifically, which I had sought out to scratch an itch that I otherwise would have had to wait for the release of Wind Waker for, I have been looking to Square Enix with hopeful puppy dog eyes for years for something in the series that made me feel the same sense of connection, and for 17 years they failed. Again, I should stress, they didn't fail everyone. Some people really enjoy what they produced in that span of time, but on a personal level, and as someone who by and large plays for the story, they failed me. And I'm honestly kind of sitting here stunned that they managed to turn it around. I guess it's a case that I've been expecting disappointment for so long I couldn't really imagine anything else. And so to me, Final Fantasy VII is something of a miracle. But if you were to ask me, are you excited after that Final Fantasy XVI trailer, the answer still would be no. I allow myself to get excited for a Zelda reveal because, frankly, Nintendo have only very rarely let me down. Spirit Tracks, I'm sorry, but you are so dull. Square Enix, they just let me down for too long. And I'll play 16, don't get me wrong, but allow myself to get excited for it? I'm more sensible than that. Thanks for watching, and as a postscript here, I do think that at some stage I'm going to make a video that dives deeper into what my now 7-year-old essay did, highlighting the Final Fantasy X timeline, why it was so resonant for me, and specifically why that 30-minute audio drama was for just about every fan a kick in the teeth, and that in the same way a host body rejects a suspicious organ transplant, we as the fandom really need to just jettison that part of the canon and never speak of it again. If I can find a way to make that video without actually having to listen to that abomination, I might actually get it done.